Greetings, everyone. My name is Reverend Dr. Karin Walker, and I coordinate the coaches for the Mid-Atlantic Foundation. So today, I'm going to talk about conflict. For a lot of years in the Baltimore, Washington Conference, and for the denomination, I served as a mediator with churches and organizations in conflict. I know that conflict, when we're talking about change, and when we think about this whole COVID era thing, and a new way of doing church for the future, that conflict is going to be a part of it. It's hard for people to give up what they've become so used to and what they really love. And our goal through conflict is to transform it to something that provides energy and a new way of thinking, and aligns people with their mission and their core values. So I want to share with you mostly a language, a vocabulary around which to talk about conflict. Let's face it, you're going to have conflict. It's just a part of what life of the church is all about, particularly in a time of transition or a time of change. So we're not going to be afraid of conflict, but if we have an understanding, a collective vernacular to use around dealing with conflict, I think that you'll find it much less oppressive and actually the beginning point for a new way of being the church together. Good conversation, dialogue, that's what we're looking for. So if we start by defining conflict, conflict really is fighting for the available resources around a whole number of things, whether it's money, whether it's space, whether it's human resources. So there's always this tension around available resources. And we're going to talk more about that as we go on. So conflict, even the word brings about fear in a lot of people. Conflict is uncomfortable. There are physical implications, and some people just don't like debate. You can get butterflies, you can get high blood pressure, headache. So there's a lot of reasons why we don't like conflict, and part of it is because we feel it physically. It actually becomes a real stress in our lives. We also are not at our best in the midst of conflict. So often there are things said off the cuff that we wish we could pull back. There are irrational behaviors that happen, or quick assumptions about the other that are made that are just less than helpful. So anger and frustration are a piece of that as well. And none of that is fun. None of that is joyful. None of that brings about life. So how do we transform this conflict into life-giving and nurturing faith and energy for the life of the church? If you take a look at this particular word, you'll see, the word sacred, and you know how to spell the word sacred. But if you misspell the word sacred, it becomes scared. So that sense of sacred gets distorted. And when it disappears, then it becomes scared space. And the two cannot coexist. And so what we're hoping to do is restore the sacred from that place of fear. So in a sacred space, there is no need to convict, convince, or convert. You think about times when you've been in conflict, how really convinced you are of your own particular point of view, and the first thing you want to do is convince someone else. But in sacred space, in a place where there's dialogue, in a place where there's listening, these are the things that we want to refrain from doing in order to keep conflict from getting really out of hand. So we're not going to convict, convince, or convert, but instead, we're going to listen and learn and lament. Those are really three powerful ways for us to be fully present to someone else, even when we totally disagree with their point of view. Listen, learn, and lament. You are an important part of the way that the conflict will get lived out in the life of your congregation. You as the core team, as people that have risen to the occasion to lead the congregation in this very important time of transition and time of change. And so to remind ourselves as leaders what it means to do that well, we need to, first of all, be God's. We belong to God, and keeping that in our hearts is the really important piece. To discern God's call, always be listening to God, always wondering what it is that God wants us to do, and making sure that our agenda is really what God's agenda is all about. And finally, to share God's love. How is it that we can best be imitators of Christ? The more that we are like Jesus, the better able we are to follow in his footsteps and do what he asks us to do. So that's our role as the leaders in conflict. When we are assessing conflict, there's, we call it the ABCDEs of conflict. So we want to assess the conflict. We want to embrace it, because we're, to shove it under the carpet isn't going to work for too long. So we're going to embrace it. We're going to clarify what it's all about. We're going to design a strategy to manage the conflict, and then to fully engage the folks that are involved so that the outcome is one that is fruitful and life-giving for everybody. So here's how we do it. How do we assess it? We're going to look at what's called RIVERS, R-I-V-I-R-S. Granted, it's not quite spelled correctly. This comes actually from the Alban Institute. So when an organization gets into conflict, it's always around these 6 things. The first is relationships. It can be around, a staff member and another staff member, pastor and a member of the congregation, a trustee and a scout leader. There are lots of things. So any kind of relationship. So if you have a conflict going on in your space or your church, and you want to figure out what it's all about, ask yourself the question, is this about a relationship? That's the first R. And then the second one is information. It's the I. Is this about information? Or most often about misinformation. So how does information travel within the life of your church? Is it by email? Is it things that happen within the context of a meeting? Or is it through the informal information trails, such as the parking lot meetings, et cetera? And so the way to kind of understand this aspect of conflict is to make sure that there are formal ways that the church manages the information, and makes sure that they're transparent in that information. The third is the V for values. In a church, there are often conflicting ways to deal with things, and we have different values. If I really believe that I want to go on a mission trip to another part of the world, someone else may say, well, we have poverty right here in our own community. We should be spending resources here first before we go around the world. That's a conflicting value. So when you're doing the assessment, ask yourself, is this a values conflict? The next I is interest. And this is more around what people want to do. So if I'm a member of congregation and I say, I want to have church at 9 a.m. on Sunday mornings, but someone else may say, oh, no, I want to have church at 11 a.m. It's really an interest. I want to do 9 because the rest of my day then is free, but someone may say, I can't get up at that early. It takes me a while to get moving, so I want to do 11 a.m. And that's the kind of thing that can cause an interest conflict. And then resources. Again, this is a lack of resources. We have $100,000 to spend a mission. How are we going to spend it? And actually, we need more than that in order to do the mission we did last year. But we don't have enough. What has to go? So budget implications, decisions around finances, shared space. You know, if the church is sharing space with a daycare, how do you manage those times when something isn't cleaned up to the standard needed? So all of those things are related to resources. And then finally, the last one is structure. If an unclear organizational structure will often lead to conflict. So if the church is going to have a ham and oyster dinner, who sets the price for that ham and oyster dinner? Is it the finance committee who knows how much they need for that particular fundraiser? Is it the ham and oyster dinner committee who knows exactly how much the oysters cost? Or is it the United Methodist Women who basically do all the work? Who sets the price? Unless there's a clear organizational structure, often there can be conflict. Same with church councils, who's on what committee, who can vote, all of those things are related to structure. So those are, that's a part of the assessment of a conflict, figuring out what kind of conflict it is, using rivers. The second piece of conflict assessment is the levels of conflict. And you'll see on the slide here that there are 5 different levels of conflict. And you can pretty much understand those 5. A level 1 or 2 conflict happen all the time. You've probably been in a disagreement at some point this week with someone in your life. When we get to conflict at level 3, it's more intentional. This is more serious. This is where our heart rate goes up, or blood pressure. This is where you begin to feel it physically, so that when you encounter someone, it's less than pleasant. Between level 3 and 4, teams or sides begin to form, and it really becomes a very critical incident within the life of the church. And finally, if it gets to a level 5, that is where the organization as we know it is destroyed, that there has to be divorce, that one party or the other leave, or unfortunately, often it means that the whole church is just broken apart as a result of the conflict. Once we get to level 3, there's often a need for intervention. Churches have a hard time backing out of a conflict in a healthy way when it's a level 3 or 4. So just bear that in mind. If we have an opportunity to deal with it when it's a level 2 or 3, it's a sliding scale, so it's never clean 1, 2, 3. But if we have a chance to deal with it at level 2 or 3, it's really important to do so. So all of that relates to assessment. And you as a team of leaders, when you encounter a conflict, what you're essentially doing is saying, okay, we want to look at this objectively. We want to identify what kind of conflict it is using the rivers. And then you want to say, well, let's figure out where we are in terms of level. We're at a level 2 conflict, so that you have an understanding, collective understanding of what you're dealing with. And then the next slide talks about moving from then where you are at that particular level of conflict to a lower level. So it's a way to say, okay, we got to back down to a different place. So you ask yourselves the question, what would it look like for conflict to be at a lower level? And then you live into that. What needs to change so that we can get back to that place? So if you're at a level 4, where you have people that are leaving, the fight or flight, because people don't like the way it makes them feel, right? So they're not going to hang around. Some people are not going to hang around the fight. They're going to leave. So what would it take for the church to really be able to back down to a level 2? And that's what you spend some time talking about. So it doesn't behoove anyone to spend time kind of going through the nuts and bolts of the conflict too much in deciding who's right and who's wrong. because the people that are wrong are going to feel like they were not listened to and leave anyway. But if you can say, what would it look like for conflict to be at a lower level, and what changes can we make so that that can happen to get back to level 2, that's where the real change can occur.